Good morning and welcome to the Crop Talks webinar series. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the questions section of the GoToWebinar menu. We will try to answer them at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and you will receive a link to the recording. Thank you.
Thanks, Teresa. I'd like to welcome everybody to the July 8th edition of Crop Talk. It's been, we took a week off there for Canada Day, and wouldn't you know it, the time we take a week off is when we get a whole bunch of things happening. And so I think we're going to have a fairly full program here today with a lot of questions and a lot of new issues happening throughout the province here. So just to go through the agenda, we're going to start with, I'm going to give a little bit of a crop update like normal, and then we're going to go into a presentation from Dane Fraze and Ann Kirk, and they're going to talk about answering the fungicide timing question, as we're right in the middle of fungicide application timing and getting lots of questions regarding best time to do things. Then from there, we'll go to our crop scouting panel, and as I mentioned, there's quite a few questions coming in these last few days regarding several items. So we'll put the panel to work and go from there. So just a few things in my update. I'm not going to take a lot of time because I'd like to give the presenters a lot of time to go through their stuff. But I think the biggest thing we need to, I guess, show for the update is the amount of rainfall we got. And I just brought up the Southwest because this seems to take in the biggest area where the major block that got hit with the largest amount of rainfall. And you could see that a lot of areas are well above their percent of normal, you know, anywhere from that, you know, we get as high as 186% of normal already. And we get areas reporting anywhere from the block from about Rapid City, maybe even a little farther west, right through the Minnedosa, down south towards Brandon, even a little south of Brandon. A lot of areas in there were reporting anywhere from 6 to 8 to, we got reports of 10, 11 inches of rain during that one storm. So, and it seems to be raining a little bit every day. One of the other good parts about this report is looking at our growing degree days, and we definitely have improved that. And with the recent heat we've been getting, that's definitely helping us out with some of the crops. So rainfall over the past 2 weeks, I mentioned that, and it's created quite a few issues throughout the province, not just in the Southwest, but throughout several other areas. We have overland flooding, we have washout roads, we've got standing waters in fields that is starting to show quite a bit of damage in some areas. And just the wet conditions in general are making it impossible in some areas to travel on the land. So producers are definitely falling behind, whether it be in crop spraying to fungicide applications. Seems like rain has been happening every second day here, and it's making it even harder to get to the fields. A lot of the pothole country is it's really starting to show the effects, and seems where most of the major rainfall events happen, we're through the pothole country, and all the potholes are filled right up and going onto the fields and starting to kill off some of the crop. Crop is still advancing, and I think that's probably one of our biggest issues is we're not able to get out on the land, and the crop is still advancing. So we really need to be watching the staging of the crop and the products being used, especially for producers in some areas that are still doing in-crop herbicide. Those areas, we definitely need to be looking at the products we're using. We're getting to the point where we're good for probably a lot of some of the broadleaf products we're using, because a lot of the crop is into the flag leaf stage. But when we're getting into some of the other products, so we're getting crops that are flowering, canola starting to bolt, we're getting soybeans that are starting to flower. And so if a lot of those fields still need either their first or second application of herbicide, and definitely need to be scouting those fields to making sure your timing isn't going to affect the crop. And I think the biggest thing right now is we don't want to stress the crop any more than it's been stressed for the last little while here. We need it to get kind of going and get ahead, get its roots established again, and get it going. And as I mentioned, the crop has been growing so fast with the warm weather here that we're into the fungicide application, and staging is starting to become an issue because the crop is growing so fast. And so it's getting a little bit more tricky as to when we should be applying fungicides, if we're on time, if we're not on time. And I thought it would be good to bring on Dane Fraze and Ann Kirk today to go through the oilseed crops and also the cereal crops to discuss the applications, the timing of application, and maybe just some of the decision making we need to be making out there as we go forward in the conditions we have. So with that, I'll turn the screen over to Dane, and we'll start with the oil seeds, and then we'll go to Ann, and from there we'll have a discussion on fungicide application.
Final. I think everybody can hear me. Appreciate you having me on again. As you mentioned, yes, crops are advancing very quickly. So we'll go through some staging for fungicide app in canola. I'll touch on flax very briefly at the end, and then I'll switch over to Ann's presentation. Okay. All right, to start off with, the first thing you should ask is, do I need to spray for Sclerotinia? We've had 2 years where it's been drier and moisture hasn't been as much of a concern as it is this year. I mean, in a different way, I suppose. But is the Sclerotinia risk in fact high? This risk checklist developed in Sweden can be useful in helping assess disease risk in those fields. Growers should fill out the checklist for each field shortly after first flower. I would say as soon as you start seeing a couple yellow flowers in that field, start evaluating and start filling this list out. And the greater the risk score that you develop at the end of this checklist, the higher the probability of a positive economic return. Results from Sweden, and again from Western Canada, it's been used in Western Canada for a number of years, have suggested that fields scoring 40 or higher will likely benefit from a fungicide, but it does vary a bit depending on fungicide cost and commodity price. So using this checklist requires scouting for Apothecia, meaning the little mushrooms that are developed from the sclerotia bodies resting in the soil. Usually in nearby cereal crops is where you want to look for those, or neighboring canola crops, or even that own crop. And other susceptible crops in rotation, your beans or sunflowers. Look for those Apothecia there so you're able to see if they're developing. So that's the bottom portion of this checklist, the bottom 3 lines. We'll quickly go through some of the other necessary items to complete this checklist, and we'll go through an example calculator that Manitoba Ag has developed to make this really quick and easy. So right now, we want to look at what Sclerotinia prevalence and incidence has been in Manitoba. These numbers show our historical average from 2011 up until last year. You'll note that the last 2 years, our Sclerotinia prevalence, meaning the number of crops that have Sclerotinia present in that crop, has dropped significantly. We've had 2 fairly dry July and August months in 2017 and 2018. So last year, our Sclerotinia prevalence was at 25%. So that's down from 94 in 2016 and 73 in 2017. So those dry summers really made a difference, meaning that a lot less sclerotia bodies were returned to the soil that could then pose as a new infection source on our current crop. So that's a good sign, meaning we can likely reduce some of that risk in the calculator that we'll bring up next. Okay, so I'm going to jump over to this spreadsheet, and we'll go through that calculator. It's available on Manitoba Ag's web pages. We'll go back to the link shortly. But right now, I just want to fill you in on how this calculator works. To start off with, we need to know the number of years since our last canola crop. In most parts of Manitoba, that is fairly short. It's usually 1 to 2 years. If you have more crops in rotation, obviously you can lengthen that. But the shorter the rotation, the higher the risk, certainly. Now, the disease incidence in the last host crop, I mentioned that overall the prevalence was about 36% in Manitoba, but the disease incidence was lower than that. It was generally between 5 to 10%. in the last year or two. So it was fairly low, but individual fields might vary. And if you participated in the canola disease survey, you might have an exact number for the field in question. But I'm going to say it's low. The crop density, you give your crop low, normal, high. Normal being 5 to 7 plants per square foot. Low being less than that. Generally, we've had a fairly normal crop, although it is stagey. So I'll leave it at normal. You can adjust that as you see fit. Rain in the last 2 weeks. Most parts of the province have received significant amount of precipitation, certainly over an inch in many areas. We're going to be on the high scale for rain in the past 2 weeks. Rain is necessary to germinate those Apothecia and have that humidity in the lower canopy in order to present that disease risk. Weather forecast. If we're in a high pressure system, generally we don't have too many turbulent weather patterns, weather systems, or a lot of rain. We've been getting variable pressure, certainly. We have a lot of fronts moving in that are bringing large amounts of rain to pockets of the province. So we're certainly in that category. And the regional risk for Apothecia development. This is where it's going to require walking through those fields at early flower or the neighboring crops, just looking for those germinating Apothecia. So if you're going to find them, none found, low numbers versus high numbers. I would next to never say that there's going to be none found. I would err on the side of caution, say it's low, possibly high. So I'm going to go with low numbers right now. Obviously, if the field is flooded and there's portions of the field underwater, that works in your favor that way, that there's no Sclerotinia spores that could then germinate. So we'll say no, low. Canola yield, I'm going to pick a number of 50 bushels. Canola I wish was worth 12 bucks, but right now it's about 10.75. Fungicide cost, anywhere between $13 and $22 an acre. 16 seems like a good spot to be at. Application cost, $5 to $6 by ground, $8 to $11 by air. I'll put $9.50 in by air since we've had a lot of wet fields that are being sprayed by plane. That gives me a very quick rundown here. My potential infection range ranges from 15 to 25%. I could see a return on per acre based on that projected yield from $14 to $41 an acre. My return on investment is positive. It's likely beneficial to spray. So if my risk factors were reduced, all of a sudden, say my weather forecast became a high pressure, I had less rain. If my field was a late blooming crop and it's dried out since that time, my spray decision becomes uncertain if beneficial to spray. So that calculator does change. So that worksheet is available on the Manitoba Ag web pages under the Farm Management, Production Economics, and Farm Software section. So this link will be emailed out to you later. When you're in the field, what are you scouting for? Your disease risk increases if you have those following conditions. The ground is damp to wet, which is the case across many farms. Your canopy is closed. As plants start to bolt and bloom, that canopy does close over. So if your row spacing is a little wider, your risk might be a little less in the fact that wind and air movement can get down to the bottom of the canopy. We often talk about the wet pants test, and that's common lingo from the Canola Council. Keith Gabbert from Southern Alberta often talks about this. When you're walking through the canola field at 10 a.m., are your pants coming out wet at that time? If they are moist, you've got high humidity down in that lower canopy, and the risk is certainly high for those spores to spread and cause infection. And then obviously your risk time is between 20 to 50% flower, and you have those germinating Apothecia. These are what those mushrooms look like. Tiny little cup-shaped mushrooms on the soil surface, usually not as dense as this. Usually there's 3 to 4 per sclerotia body, not quite as many. And as they release spores, you can see this cloud coming off the surface. Those tiny, tiny millions and millions of microspores are what are looking for a susceptible host, either canola petal and then into that canola crop. Now, I get asked about timing of flowering and when to spray and what should be happening there. Flowering is largely driven by environmental conditions, moisture, humidity, temperature. It's been extremely warm in much of Manitoba for the past week and a half. So the crop is advancing very quickly, as Lionel mentioned. I've seen canola crops go from 10 to 20% bloom in as little as 1 day, and from 20 to 30 in another half a day in some cases, and then we can reach 50% bloom in as little as 3 days after flower initiation can start. So it's gone very quickly. That is if the field is fairly uniform. If the field's not as uniform, certainly it does take more time to get more of those flowers in that optimum stage. If you're looking at it from a growing degree perspective, it takes about 300 GDDs to move from first flower to 50%. Usually there's about 3 to 5 new flowers open per day, but that has been rapidly advancing. We're looking at more like 8 to 10 in some cases right now. All right, we'll talk about this a little bit more as we move through some of the pictures. All right, 10% flower. We're going to get about 10% flowers open on the main stem, that main raceme. We're not looking at the axils, and we're not looking at the side branches. We're looking for blooms and already formed pods on that main stem. Usually happens about 2 to 4 days after that first bloom. This would be now 20%, where we're starting to reach our recommended spray window. Most fungicides label Sclerotinia spray applications between 20 and 50% bloom. So here we're looking at 14 to 16 flowers open on that main stem, or pods already formed. We do sometimes mention pods seen, but it can go very quickly, because we would hope a canola flower lasts for about 5 days for bloom time. But with the heat and the rapid growth that we've been seeing, those canola flowers are lasting for 1 to 3 days right now. And they're not lasting nearly as long as they would have otherwise. So we're going to see a shortened flowering window in canola this year. This is a picture I took just the other day. Here we're looking at 20% bloom out in the field. I have 1 or 2 heat aborted pods down here at the base. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. So we are certainly on the upper edge of that 20% bloom. We're nearing 30. This would be about 25%. That 20% bloom field looks something like this. Reasonably uniform in this scenario, but not completely yellow. It's not a carpet of yellow. We're going to see that maximum intensity yellow at 50% bloom. Now, 30%, this is the perfect world ideal scenario where you want to target your bloom. 20 flowers open, your stem is certainly elongated. You're getting that stretching of that main raceme between each flower. Usually about 6 to 10 days after the first flower, but we're seeing it as few as 4 right now. And petals are certainly starting to drop. This is where we're trying to protect the maximum number of petals before those petals fall and become a food source for the Sclerotinia infection. There's my perfect 30 or 20 blooms, and you can certainly see the main raceme stretching as there's more elongation between each pod versus the cluster at the top still hasn't quite stretched out. That's your 30% bloom field. You can certainly see there's some petals drop down in the base here, the canopy, but you can look into the canopy and still see green. So that's an indicator that it's not reached full bloom potential yet. Versus 50% flower. More than 20 flowers are open. The stem is quite elongated. You're not getting that cluster of new flowers at the top of the raceme. There's many pods still already formed, as you can see here, and about a week after that first flower happens. 50% bloom out in the field. That's what that'll look like. I should stand corrected. This was a very, very well fertilized field and had perfect moisture. So it's got a long stem with lots of pods and still a few more to come up top. There's your 50% bloom. It really can't get much yellower than that. Obviously, right at the edge here at the headland, it's still a little bit delayed, but that's really what we're looking at, 50% bloom. This is the late application for Sclerotinia fungicide app. Moving later than this, you end up potentially wasting a little bit more money because those petals have already dropped and you can't protect them once they've already landed on the leaf surface. That is the goal here. A wet, high sugar content flower petal is the perfect food source for Sclerotinia spores to land on, beginning infection. So by coating those petals with a fungicide prior to petal drop, those petals then won't act as a fungal food source, an infection point in the leaf axils where the disease could quickly establish in the plant's vascular tissue, choking it off and causing yield loss. By waiting till more flowers are out or more tillers start to bloom, if the canola is quite branchy, you risk losing that early infection protection. An early infection under the right conditions, like we have now with high humidity and high temperature and high moisture, those early infections can be more yield damaging than a late infection, since most of the plant's yield comes from that main stem, not the later blooming tillers. So I do get challenged on that from time to time that, oh, we should be targeting more like 50% bloom to get as many petals as possible. That is not in fact the case. You're going to be getting more petals when you're targeting 20 to 30% bloom, since you're trying to get them before they fall down and lodge in that canopy. Now, if your canola is still in the 6-leaf stage on July 8th, risk conditions could change. I mean, it certainly could be a week or more before bolting starts to occur and flowering. So we have, if the next week stays dry, your Sclerotinia risk could be reduced. So you may not need to spray it at that case. But if it does start flowering in a week with the warm temperatures we've had, soils are moist, your canopy is damp, the canopy is dense, you've got a thick canola crop, the RH is above 80%, the risk is still high for development. So you consider your need to spray and potentially spray a little on the earlier side. Now, Lionel did pose a couple questions to me on flax. So before the panel gets onto it, I'll see if I can address it here. The thought was when to spray. How do I target bloom timing and spraying fungicides in flax? The main culprit that we're looking after here is Pasmo. Shown in the photo is driven by spore dispersal through wind and rain from infected crop stubble. So crop rotation is the biggest factor in reducing Pasmo. But if you do have risk or you want to try and prevent Pasmo infection and lodging as a result, fungicide applications do show that they can reduce Pasmo by 30 to 60% or improve yield or save yield, I guess, by 15 to 25%. Flowering in flax lasts about 3 weeks, but each individual flower only blooms for a single day. So trying to target the petals before petal drop isn't the main operative in flax, because Pasmo is not a petal feeding type of disease. That would be more of a Sclerotinia, which certainly can infect flax, but is usually less damaging than what Pasmo can be. With Pasmo, we're looking at foliar and stem protection. So wide target window in flax, earlier is usually better, but we'll discuss that just now. So these are the fungicide options in flax. Since some fungicides are systemic, read the group 11 strobilurins, while some are contact, the group 3s or the azoles, they have different windows of application. Contact fungicides require covering most of the petals and trying to get those petals coated, while systemic fungicides aren't as particular. You're really just trying to get the green material then at the plant. You can see that the language is not consistent from each fungicide product, and that reflects the contents of what that product's made of. Because each bloom only lasts a short amount of time, the later a fungicide is applied, particularly those strobies or group 11s, the later crop can stay green into harvest. So using your best judgment of bloom timing with what your intended product use is. So target that 20% bloom, 20 to 30% bloom, usually about 7 days after the first flower starts to occur. The photo sent in to me was of this field here. I would say that this field is 3 to 5% bloom. You can see that there's a number of flower buds starting. Give this field another 4 to 5 days likely, and it'll probably be in that optimum timing for a fungicide application if weather conditions hold up and everything stays the same. So it's Wednesday now. I would aim for probably a Saturday spray, perhaps Monday, Tuesday next week. All right, that's all I had on Sclerotinia and flax fungicides. That's where you can get a hold of me, and please switch it over to Anne now.
Okay, hi there. Sorry about that, starting in the middle there. So I'll be talking about FHB fungicide timing for barley and wheat. So FHB, I'm assuming most people know it's a fungal disease. It can affect a wide range of crops, so your wheat, barley, oats, other small grain cereals, and corn. The main crops that we are concerned about are wheat, barley, and corn for FHB. It does affect kernel development, reducing yield in grain, as well as the ability to market your grain if it produces the mycotoxin DON. So high levels of moisture favor disease development. So the situation that we're in right now, we do see high levels of moisture throughout much of the province and high humidity. And more spores are released in the days following a rain event. So after we have those big rain events, we would expect the risk to be increased in the days following. And the optimum temperature for spore development is about 25 degrees Celsius, but there's a range there. It could be, say, 18 to 30 degrees Celsius. So for the wheat, oats, and barley, we do see that durum is the most susceptible crop, followed by Canadian Prairie Spring wheat, then hard red spring, then barley, and then oats are the least susceptible. We don't really talk about FHB and oats a lot, but they are susceptible as well. I did actually have a question this morning. Dennis Lang just called me before Crop Talk to ask about FHB and fall rye because someone had questioned him about it. So I actually wasn't sure either how common it is for FHB and fall rye, but from what I've learned this morning, there is very little known about FHB and fall rye, and researchers aren't sure how serious of a concern it might be in rye crops. So because of the unknown of how fall rye is unknown for FHB, there has been some research started with Ag Canada and the U of M. So the U of M research farm in Carmen has FHB nurseries. So they've actually been testing fall rye for FHB the last couple of years to see how it responds to FHB infection and what the results are. So we do know that rye has the ability to tolerate a lot of disease. And after evaluating these lines in the FHB nursery, results have shown that that FHB does occur in rye, and some lines are more resistant than others. So we do see a lot of lines that are resistant, but some are susceptible. And from this research, it appears that FHB infection tends to cause the rye plants not to set seed. So at this point, researchers are assuming that the biggest problem from FHB for rye might be yield loss, as opposed to a crop that you can't market due to FDK and DON. So that's the information I have about rye. If people are interested, I'm assuming we'll have more concrete information in the years to come. Okay, so the life cycle of FHB. It overwinters as mycelium or spores in crop debris, and seedlings are often affected at emergence. So we do see that as the warm, moist weather develops, spores are dispersed by wind and rain splash to the aerial parts of the plants. And plants are most susceptible to FHB infection at 50 to 75% anthesis, but infection can occur from flowering right up until the hard dough stage of development. And because symptoms are most often observed after flowering, we can't wait to see if the weed is going to get FHB before we have the chance to control it. So the risk map, this is from Monday. We do see that much of the province is an extreme risk rating for FHB, with portions of high and a very small area of moderate. So this is a result of the high humidity that we've had over the past few days, as well as a lot of rain events throughout the province. The animation, this is showing the animation from the website over the last, I think, 5 days. And you can really see that things do change so much depending on the weather conditions. So these risk maps are based on the temperature and humidity. So it is important that as your crop is reaching the flowering stage, that it's scouted often, and the risk maps are checked often to see what stage the crop is at and how risky it is in terms of FHB. So I think most people are familiar with FHB symptoms in wheat. The left-hand side is kind of the classic picture of bleach spikelets with that salmony pink colored spores. In the field, we do see when we're trying to rate for FHB, the ideal timing is when most of the spikes are green, but then we do see those sections in the crop that do have FHB. And then kernels do tend to be bleached and shriveled, and when with higher cases, they do have that pinky color on the kernels. Barley is a bit tougher to observe for FHB. The symptoms don't tend to be quite as extreme as for spring wheat, the visual symptoms, and those awns probably get in the way a bit for trying to rate it, but it's very similar symptoms to wheat, where you see those shriveled and bleached kernels and the bleached spikelets. So the ideal timing for fungicide application in wheat is early flower. So the field's considered to be anthesis when half of the wheat heads across the field have entered the flowering stage. So where half of the flowers of the head are visible. So this is because cereal crops are most vulnerable to infection at flowering time, and the FHB spores infect the cereal plant by entering the openings created where the anthers form on the head. So this picture on the right here is a great picture from NDSU showing 3 wheat spikes. So on the left, it's too early for FHB application. In the middle, you can just see those yellow anthers coming out, and that would be the optimal timing for FHB application. And then on the right-hand side, you can see that those flowers have turned white and are shriveled, and they've already they've died and released their pollen. So because wheat can progress fairly quickly through these stages, it is really important to scout often and to make sure when people are scouting that you're looking at the main stem or the first tiller, because that would be the most important spike to target. So there's usually a 4 to 5 day window for fungicide application in wheat, but this really depends on how hot and humid it is. You know, since we're seeing higher temperatures and more humidity, wheat will be moving through those growth stages more quickly. And I think the next. So this is showing those growth stages from wheat being in the boot to wheat being finished flowering. So depending on how warm it is, wheat could move through these stages of development in as little as 5 days to more than a week. And we know that under ideal growing conditions, the time from head just emerging to the boot to the beginning of flowering is 3 days. So if you're often scouting fields and you can see, say, the second picture where the head is partially coming out of the boot, you know that you probably have 3 days before optimal timing for FHB application. Fungicide application in barley is a bit different. Barley begins to flower in the boot, but because flowering begins before the spike emerges, barley florets are not overly susceptible to FHB infection because they are protected by being in the plant still. So the optimum timing for applying fungicides to barley is when the spike is fully emerged from the boot. So you can see the left-hand side is when flowering is likely starting. The second picture shows heads partially emerged. And then the third picture is when you would want to target FHB application timing, when the head is fully emerged so you can actually protect the entire head with the application. So the appearance of the first spikelet from the boot is a good indication that the best stage for spraying is just a few days away. And for barley, FHB infections don't generally impact yield, but it can result in dawn production, which impacts market value, particularly for the malting industry. So for malting beer, if there is too much FHB in the beer, it causes sort of the beer to explode when you open it, which is not what the maltsters and brewers are going for. So we do know that weather is the #1 factor to consider when deciding to spray for FHB in wheat and barley, but we also do know that late infections can increase dawn in the plant. So say you're in a situation, I think the decision to spray is kind of cut and dry for most of the province right now, but if we were in a situation where the risk of infection is low and you decide not to spray right now, and then say 5 days from now or 4 days from now, we get some hot and humid weather, things are turning around and there's more of a risk factor, those late infections can increase dawn, even though the wheat is likely past the 50 to 75% flowering stage. There is research that suggests that fungicide can continue to provide suppression of FHB and decrease dawn levels when applied 4 to 6 days after the start of flowering. So later than ideal application timing, but could still provide some protection if conditions weren't right to spray, at the prime time. So that's all I have for wheat and barley, FHB.
Okay, thanks. And there is, I've got a couple questions. So I think what we'll do is I'm going to get Teresa to give me my screen back, and we'll go into the panel discussion. And what we'll do is we'll ask those questions that came in while you guys were presenting right at the beginning of the panel discussion. So there's the members of our panel. I've introduced them quite a few times, and they're here with us again today to answer some questions. And so the first one I think I'll ask is, I guess, to Dane, is there a time when you would say the fungicide app isn't worth it as yield is lowering because of the wet conditions? I know you use the calculator, but the fields are so uneven right now because of the wet conditions. What's your thoughts on that?
It's an individual judgment call that the producer and their agronomist would need to make. Certainly, Ann and I discussed it actually up in the office too. If say you have a wheat field and the canola field that are both side by side, the wheat's handling that excess moisture a little bit better. We thought that it would be more advantageous to do the fungicide in wheat if there's still a decent crop there, given that there is more chance of downgrading in that cereal crop from fusarium versus, and the quality loss that could be compared to it versus a thinner canola crop that's not handling the moisture terribly well, that it's super waterlogged. In fact, if it's too waterlogged, it's just simply too wet for those Apothecia to germinate and they'll drown. So then that risk is then reduced versus fusarium is a little bit more windborne in some ways and can move in that way. So I would focus maybe on your cereals if that's the situation and your canola crop is really thin. If your canola crop is looking a little bit better, oh boy, it's tough to say do or do not when I haven't seen the field myself.
Okay.
Sclerotinia is primarily a yield loss factor, not so much a quality factor. So if it's coming in late, all of a sudden the crop looks really good late in the season, you didn't spray early, there may be some protection warranted on some of those later blooming plants.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So basically, should be looking at those areas where kind of the in-between areas, the areas that aren't going to make it, and then look at the areas that are going to make it and kind of make an assessment of how those plants are going to do.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, even if spraying part of the field is worth it, or contracting the plane out and do part of this field and part of that field, and that way you get a full quarter section, that might be a more applicable way of doing it, saving those high value parts of the field and letting the low stuff kind of go as it was.
Okay, and a question regarding the decision tool, and the way it reads is the decision tool doesn't ask about varieties. Do varieties make a difference in using that decision tool?
Very little. Canola varieties are generally all relatively uniformly susceptible to Sclerotinia. I know in the past there have been some varieties that had a Sclerotinia resistant or tolerant rating. That was found not to really be the case. There are breeding efforts underway to improve Sclerotinia tolerance in canola crops, but we are still several years away from that. So right now, variety doesn't really make a difference other than plant architecture. If one variety might be slightly bushier than another versus not, that makes a difference in terms of how lush the canopy is. That's all.
Okay, a question for Ann. Being that timing is such a small window, application after the flowering point or after the best time, am I getting any benefit? I guess you did mention you were getting some benefit, but even if I'm later than that, I guess the question is that, you know, that was done flowering and I still want to spray, will controlling leaf disease be something that'll help control or be better for the plant?
Yeah, it's a good question. So like in terms of FHB, some research has shown that late applications can be beneficial. I think I've seen up to 10 days after the start of flowering could be beneficial, but not a lot of research has been done here. And there were some on-farm trials a couple of years ago where we looked at late timing of FHB, and unfortunately those were just really dry years and we didn't really see differences in the plots just because of the growing conditions. But the Manitoba wheat and barley growers are currently conducting some more on-farm trials. So maybe they'll have some results from those. In terms of protecting the flag leaf, like protecting the flag leaf does obviously impact yield. I'm not super up on my fungicides, so I'm not entirely sure, you know, applying fungicides that late in the season for the flag leaf, how that will impact things, because yield is kind of, like the seeds are always getting bigger and seed weight is being determined later on. So perhaps protecting that flag leaf could result in some, you know, higher test weights or higher 1,000 kernel weights, but I'm not entirely sure how that would affect. But I'm going to look into that.
Okay, good, thanks. Back to Dane. You mentioned with this heat that we might see some shortening flowering time. Is that going to have I guess a factor on yield?
Time will tell on that one. The shortened flowering time doesn't necessarily mean less yield. What it means is that each flower is obviously shorter lived on the plant. There could be less time that each flower is pollinated, but that's not usually a concern given that wind does 90% of pollination in canola anyway. The shortened window is only a concern if we have heat blast accompanying it, and that's reducing the survivability of pollen and some of those flowers themselves. Heat blast is generally most severe under hot and dry conditions. We have been hot and humid, and we've had enough moisture for the most part, unless you're in certain areas, particularly in the northwest of Manitoba. Evapotranspiration does act as a good cooling or air conditioning for canola plants. So if we have enough moisture that plant is able to pump it through its stomatopores and off its leaf surfaces, it does act to cool itself in that way. So heat blast does become somewhat more reduced or limited in that scenario, but not non-existent.
Okay, I'm going to give you two guys a break, and I'm going to go to Dennis Lang, spraying for mycospirilla blight. We have talked before about the proper timing and application, but how late can I spray, and will late applications help?
Yeah, Lionel, thanks. Can you show my screen here if you wouldn't mind?
Sure. Teresa, can you give Dennis the screen?
Okay, so I think one of the more important things you really need to pay attention to is the actual staging of the crop. Right now, we're sitting somewhere between R2 on some of the real late season fields to all the way up to R4 growth stage. You need to know what stages you're at. Now, both of these last two photographs here are from the Manitoba Pulse and Soybean Grower Staging Guide. Probably the best way to look at it, so let's say you're looking at a late first application, and you go out and you start scouting, and you haven't sprayed yet, and you start to see basically still some flat pods yet on the majority of the plant. That's the R3 stage. Then you're good to go. So flat pods, still okay to spray. If you have sprayed once and then you're debating whether you're going to spray again, and you go out and look at the field and you have full pods anywhere on the plants, then you're done. and you're done for two reasons. The main reason is that the pre-harvest interval is probably about, for a lot of products, is around 30 days. And when you hit that R4 stage, you're pretty close to that 30-day pre-harvest interval. The other reason for it is, I was talking to Sherilyn Phelps from Saskatchewan, and they've done a lot of work on this as well. And what they find is that you can get microsporal blight moving in at any time. The later it moves in, the less damage it does. So if you have light infection even after the R4 stage, you're really not going to see that plant be affected to the same degree as if it was at the R2 stage. So really, full pods, you're done spraying. Flat pods, you're still able to spray yet. So those are some of the things to kind of look for.
Okay, good. Thanks, Dennis. Teresa, if you can give me the screen back. Thanks. Okay, next question for John Gavlosky. Got this from Crop Scout this week. He was out in some wheat and fall rye. He was wanting to know, are they cereal armyworms, and what is the threshold at this time of year?
So yes, both of those are armyworm or cereal armyworm. Don't mistake them for birth armyworm, which comes out later and is specific to broadleaf crops. Cereal armyworm highly prefers grassy crops over broadleaf crops. They will sometimes nibble at broadleaf crops. They generally don't do a lot of damage to those. It's the cereal crops that they really prefer. You'll notice they can vary in color quite a bit, just like birth armyworm. You can have lighter or darker versions of them. Generally, they do have this orange stripe along the side if you look hard, and they'll have a couple lines on their head caps. So right now we're seeing a lot of these across, I'll say, all of southern Manitoba. I've had reports of economic levels from the eastern region, South Interlake, several places in the central region, some areas of the southwest. So people growing cereal crops or forage grasses should probably be scouting for those right now. In cereal crops, we use a threshold of about 4 per square foot, so that's fairly high threshold, but some people are going over that. So have a look and see what's there. Generally, shake the plants, knock everything that might be on the plants to the ground. If they're up on the plants during the day, they are likely parasitized, because normally they like to be on the ground hiding during the day. So do your counting on the ground and figure out how much you've got.
Okay, just got word that the rye field was actually sprayed in the southwest here. So, okay, the next question. This one was going to be for Dame, and he answered it already. So we're going to go on to question for John Hurd. And Teresa, if you could unmute, and John is with her this morning. And the question is, where are all my nutrients? With these rains, has my fertilizer ran away? And I'm getting calls from producers regarding yellow looking canola. I'm getting calls from producers. I was in a field yesterday of purple showing up in canola. So John, if you're there, if you could take a stab at that one.
Yeah, it's a long answer, so I'll write some of it up in the crop pest report. But bottom line is, yes, some of those nutrients have gone away. What is this canola telling me? The nutrient that it was short of was oxygen. You know, that's the first nutrient that runs out when we get waterlogged soil, and then all kinds of crap happens. You know, if soils are waterlogged, they're not taking up the macronutrients. If they're waterlogged, manganese and iron can actually increase to toxic levels. There's just a lot of bad things happening when soils are waterlogged and crops are growing rapidly. So if you're asking about the nitrogen, yes, nitrogen can leach if we have soils that are sandy or other. 1 inch of rain on a coarse sand will move 7 to 10 inches. So it can move our nitrogen to depth. less so on the clays, but in that puddle out there in the field or where water's standing, we can lose 8 pounds of nitrogen per acre per day to denitrification. The decision on whether to supplement, we need two things. We need to know what's the yield potential, what is the amount of nitrogen losses, and then what's the probability of response. Yield potential, according to the canola guide, one of them is saying that if we get standing water for 3 days at the rosette stage, we're about a 20 to 30% yield loss. We may not need a lot of extra nutrients if we have low yield potential. That's what I'm looking at in your picture right now, is something that has lowered yield potential. So I'd be cautious about throwing more good money after bad. The guide, I don't have anything nice to say here, Lionel. Why don't I just write this up in the crop pest report and people can read the grim story there.
Okay, yeah, I think a lot of producers are maybe not as concerned with the yellow spots or the yellow picture I've got on the screen there, but on the better land, on the higher land where it's still dark green, and if you look in the background of that picture, you can see the dark green. Should they be concerned with that up there? It didn't show any, hasn't changed any symptoms, so it should probably be okay, I would think. Or what are your thoughts there?
Well, our guideline that Don Flayton and I cooked up on the back of an envelope for situations where we have good yield potential, but nitrogen losses have occurred, you could consider going back with a third of your nitrogen to replace. But that decision's a lot tougher when your yield potential is reduced. So that would probably be about the most that we would invest in that crop. This canola may still have potential to make use. Right now at that stage, that crop going through the bolting stage should be taking up 5 to 9 pounds of nitrogen per acre per day. That's what it's wanting to do, but it can't do right now when it's waterlogged or in recovery. But yeah, if you have areas with good yield potential that's still there, then in those areas it may be worth investing. We don't have a lot of good data on that. If someone's going to try it, you've got a lot of really good on-farm testers in that flooded area. If they want to do strips, I want to talk to them at harvest.
Okay, thanks, John. I'm not going to leave this slide here because a question came in actually for Dennis Lang. And do I need to worry about disease in my peas if no history of peas in the field?
In particular, I guess if you're looking, there's always going to be some disease showing up right now. I think you still need to scout for, if you're spraying for Microspirilla blight, you still need to scout for those purple freckles on the plant, and also scout for root rots as well. So, there are other, the root rots can affect many different crops. So definitely something you want to scout just to see what you have there. And as far as Microspirilla blight goes, I would still use that risk analysis that we looked at in the previous week's webinar. So. Okay,
good. Thanks, Dennis. We will go to the next slide. This will be for John Gavlosky regarding wheat midge. On the western side here, getting some reports from some of the scouts that they're looking for wheat midge. So I just wanted you to give your input on wheat midge as you see it so far.
So yeah, based on our degree day models, we're into the early stages of wheat midge emergence. So southwest region, roughly about 15% emergence. So it's starting, and now's the time to be looking. Ideally with wheat midge, you want to be scouting from the time the wheat starts coming out, or the wheat head starts coming out, until anthers start forming. That's the critical period to scout for wheat midge. No high populations have been reported yet, but again, we're very early stages of emergence right now. I know it's a frustrating technique. It's a matter of trying to assess what's there when they're starting to fly in the evening and lay their eggs. And it needs to be done right before the sun is setting. Not always the most convenient technique, but again, now's the time to be doing that. If you've got some wheat fields that were seeded earlier and that already have anthers on them, you don't need to worry about those. They're no longer susceptible to wheat midge. So it's probably those later seeded wheat fields that you need to be scouting, and it's just wheat. You don't have to worry about barley and rye and oats and the other cereals. The slide also shows on the left another fly that can easily be confused with wheat midge, the loxanid fly. And you will see loxanids in cereal fields and in pretty much any type of field. Their juveniles are decomposers. They like feeding on things like stubble and decaying plant material on the soil. So you find these in pretty much any field, and they can be sometimes very abundant. So if you're seeing those, don't get too panicky. They're not wheat midge. You'll see loxanids during the day. Wheat midge, you likely won't see it all during the day. They only come up and start flying at night. During the day, they're usually hiding down underneath trash and debris on the field.
Okay, great. Thanks, John. I guess another one for you, John. This is one of my questions. I see this every year in the field and always get a few questions regarding it. You want to maybe just explain what's happening there?
Okay, so now that there's many different causes of whiteheads in wheat, but one test to see if it might be insect related is to very gently pull on that wheat head. And if you can really easily pull that out of the stem without giving it a hard tug, then it's something called wheat stem maggot. Not wheat stem softfly, wheat stem maggot. Wheat stem maggot, it's a fly that lays its eggs into the stems. The larvae live usually in the upper part of the stem and will essentially sever the head a little ways down on that stem, usually around the first or second node. So you can easily slide that right out. This time of year, you may still find the maggots in the stem. You may not. They could be starting to turn to pupa already, and all you see is the whiteheads. This usually looks a lot worse than it is. If you have even one of these whiteheads, say for every 30 or 40 plants, it looks horrible. But economically, it's not as bad as it may seem in generally. And even that the one every 30 or 40 plants, that would be a very heavy infestation of wheat stem maggot. Unfortunately, there's nothing you can do. You can't spray an insecticide for them. People have done trials to see if they could make insecticides work for this insect, and the adults fly over a very long period of time. It would require multiple applications targeting the adults, which are hard to monitor for. Right now, when you see whiteheads, you're way past that stage anyway. So there's really nothing you can do. So something you kind of almost have to put the blinders on.
Okay, and just another quick question for you, John. When you were talking about the cereal armyworm, if they're clipping heads, what was the threshold again?
Okay, so with cereal armyworm, the threshold we normally use is 4 per square foot. There is a recommendation, though, that if you do see them clipping heads, lower that to 2 per square foot.
Okay, okay, good. No, that was just somebody had sent in a question regarding that. So
yeah, that's good to address. Thanks.
Okay, good. Thanks, John. While I'm on the picture of a cereal crop, I've got a question for Tammy. Question is, just 1 second, I'm pulling it up here. Okay, what are my options to control kochia in standing wheat at booting stage? It's all over the field. We used Bactrol M before and it didn't work. Now want to use MCPA ester. Any thoughts? And I'm assuming this is going to be fairly big kochia by now.
Okay, so I think there's all sorts of, there's all sorts of wrong with this particular scenario, right? So MCPA on 2 to 4 leaf stage of kochia, you might get some decent control of it. At this size of kochia, I don't expect good control. One of the other things that we need to think about is that, pardon me, for MCPA, the staging for application is up to flag leaf emergence, and you sound like you're looking at something that's a little bit later than that. So a late application of MCPA can lead to malformed heads, sterility, and some significant yield loss. So I'm not sure it's worthwhile to make that MCPA application. The possibilities become really limited after that. Group 2s, almost every kochia plant is resistant to group 2s. So while those might have some later opportunities, they don't fix this particular scenario as well. And the other thing with MCPA, with some of the heat days that we've had, hot days that we've been having, 27 degrees Celsius do not apply. So for lots of reasons, I don't recommend going in there. One additional one is just another application of MCPA after we've already used Buctril M, which has MCPA, and it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense either. And then the final thing, just to go back to something that Dennis talked about earlier, is look at your pre-harvest intervals on a lot of these types of products. With MCPA, there isn't a pre-harvest interval listed, but for a lot of other products there are, and some of those are 60 days, so there wouldn't be an opportunity to put some of the others that I would think about as an option onto this crop, because the pre-harvest interval is going to eliminate them. So if it's all over in the field and you are willing to take the risk for significant yield loss, then maybe try a high rate of MCPA, but I don't recommend it. I think that you're looking at maybe mowing out some patches or silaging some of that area or doing something else that's a better opportunity than trying to go in with a revenge spray and possibly hurt yield potential even more.
Okay, thanks, Tammy. Okay, so that gets our questions. I wanted to bring everybody's attention to the crop diagnostics goal, especially when I still have the panel still here. A lot of these folks are presenting throughout the crop diagnostics school, and if you're interested, it is now live. There's the link right there to get the information to join it. You will get or have the ability to watch and listen to all these presenters. Anybody on the panel want to mention anything about the diagnostics school? They started yesterday, how they're going. Anybody interested in saying anything?
I can say something.
Sure, go ahead.
So their registration is still open. The access is all month long. There is some fantastic information in there. I mean, we talk sclerotinia, we talk fusarium head blight, we talk herbicide resistant weeds. The content in here is as good as anything in person, and you get the flexibility of going to your bathroom instead of a porta potty, and drinking all the cold water that you want instead of getting sunstroke out in the field. So lots of great material there, and there will be, in addition to the chats, then these weekly calls as well every Thursday. So just really good opportunities. Just take advantage of those opportunities to ask questions and learn whatever you need to learn.
Great, thanks, Tammy. Okay, so from there we'll go through a few of the ending slides for the day. I guess the crop production guides are still out there for sale, especially if you're looking at fungicides and insecticides right now. If you're needing more information, they're still available. Like always, the seasonal reports are on our website. Go to them for good information regarding the growing conditions. John Hurd mentioned the the updates for insects, disease, and growing conditions will be all on there. So any updates he wanted to give you regarding the fertilizer issues will all be in there. So definitely go there. The extension specialists for Manitoba, all listed there again. And if you need any help with anything or advice or even just wanting to get extra information, give these people a call. And join us next week, July 15th. And as you're out scouting, don't just keep your head in the ground looking down at the weeds and the disease, because you never know what you'll walk into. I managed to see this guy looking at me across the road. So I guess with that, we'll end it for this week, and thanks for attending.